The fact that Ocarina of Time is even functional may have been remarkable 20 years ago, but that doesn't matter to gamers today playing for fun. For people who aren't concerned with historical appreciation, what does this game offer? Well, there's plenty of content and the presentation is charming. The world, the characters, and the music all have a quaint feel. It even has good game feel. I like how Link yells every time you roll or side hop. It's nice when your sword hits an enemy and they flash red, flinch, groan or scream, and blood spews out. There's a great squishy sound as your sword's attack animation follows through. When you hit an enemy's shield or an invulnerable part of their body, your sword bounces off with sparks and a high-pitched clank sound. The audio-visual feedback is satisfying and it makes it clear exactly what is happening in combat. Unfortunately, the feedback is just lipstick on a pig. Audio-visual effects make the game intelligible and superficially pleasing to play, but the systems underneath the feedback are bare bones. That is Ocarina's greatest flaw. Despite all the charms, the gameplay itself just isn't that much to write home about, even as someone who writes home relatively frequently. Let's start with the combat. Link's got a few attacks with minor differences, but the enemies don't bring out those differences much. The attacks I found a niche for were the quick thrust attack, the wide range spin slash, and the high damage jump attack. There were situations where each of these were the best choice, but there's not a significant difference in outcome, depending on which one you choose. You can stun some enemies with Deku Nuts or even use bombs and spells in combat if you really want to get wild, but it's faster just to spam whatever sword option seems appropriate in that situation. One item I do get a kick out of using is the long shot against like-likes. They work like a normal hookshot target, but they're stunned when they get hit, so you can hookshot them, and then as you're pulled in right up to their face, they're still stunned, and you get an easy kill. Aside from that comical weakness, like-likes can also be one-shotted with a fire arrow, one-shotted with a big Goron sword, or one-shotted by Din's fire. A lot of enemies in Ocarina of Time have that problem. They're usually slow and not that threatening in the first place, but on top of that they have some other crippling weaknesses. Take Redeads for example. I like the idea. They're slow, grappling enemies that typically come in groups. They should impede movement and invalidate the shield, which is usually near invincible, but it's easy to evade because they're too slow and they're not put in cramped enough environments. You can just run right past them. You can also stun them with Deku Nuts or by playing the Sun Song. If you've got time to kill, you can even slowly walk past them and they won't even notice you. This game has some cool enemy design ideas, but they're invalidated by how easy it is to just immediately destroy or just run past them. Beery have contact damage and shock you if you hit them with a sword, but you can just ignore them because they're slow. Baby Dodonkos explode after you kill them, but you got plenty of time to get away. Tail Pasarans have an invulnerable head, but you can just walk past them and pretend they don't exist. Octoroks attack from range and go underwater when you get close, but they don't lead their shots enough to hit you, so you can just walk right by them. Tektites turn slowly, so just waltz past them and watch them struggle to track you. Stall Childs, if you don't feel like wasting precious microseconds of your time killing them, you can just keep a steady pace, and they'll never catch up to you. P-Hats, don't go near them and they won't bother you. Bubbles, there's apparently 4 different versions of these guys, but I don't think I attacked or got attacked by any of them once. Yeah, these are called bubbles. Oh, those? No, those aren't bubbles. Those are shabombs. Is someone on the Zelda wiki just fucking around? I'm not against evasion being an important part of a combat system, but this game is not well suited to it. Just rolling is fast enough to evade enemies. You don't need to work in faster but more niche movement options like side hops or walking backwards when you're evading enemies. Enemies don't have tracking projectiles that you need to dodge while running away either. The topography of the map is not demanding to navigate. There is no stamina management that might be relevant while running away. Running past enemies is not fun, but many enemies can just be run past. It's no wonder Ocarina will so often lock you in a room and force you to kill enemies to progress because the enemy designs themselves don't demand engagement. Aside from the passivity, slowness, and hard weaknesses, there's also a need for enemies to counter the shield better. Like-likes in Redead nominally counter the shield, but as I explained earlier, they fail in practice. The shield is so strong because enemy encounters are usually one-on-one, and Z targeting makes it easy to strafe around that one enemy, so it's easy to keep a shield in between you and your enemy. You can't hold it up while moving unless you're locked on, but there's no reason not to lock on in combat 95% of the time. There's no stamina or durability system, and the enemies designed to counter the shield fail at it, so I'm not saying every game needs stamina or durability, obviously, or even enemies designed to counter the shield, but you need some sort of counterplay to complicate the use of the shield. It's too safe. The Deku shield can be burned up by some fire attacks, which is neat, but the vast majority of your time in this game will be spent with the Hylian shield, which has no such weakness. If you want to go out of your way to make the combat more fun, you can do a kinda lengthy fetch quest to get the big Goron sword. It melts enemies even faster than the Master Sword, but it does require a modicum of spacing. At the end of the day, though, it's pointless trying to find fun in this combat system. There's no challenge, and there's no room for creativity. You do spend a lot of time in combat, so it's disappointing there's not much of interest. Combat is just one facet of the game, though, and it's really not the facet that most people praise when they praise Ocarina of Time. What people really love are the dungeons. For a good overview of the style of Ocarina's dungeons, watch this episode of Boss Keys on them. The most praise I hear about the dungeons, though, is that they're visually distinct and lengthy, especially compared to Breath of the Wild, but that's faint praise. Breath of the Wild does have shorter and more visually similar dungeons, but they're also much more interesting from a gameplay perspective. They all take inspiration from Ocarina's best dungeon, the Water Temple. In the Water Temple and Breath of the Wild's dungeons, you manipulate the dungeon itself instead of just going through rooms. This is interesting because it means you need a map of the dungeon in your head, which you then manipulate to achieve the desired outcome. Beyond actually solving the puzzle, navigating the dungeon can be a challenge, since manipulating the structure can impede your movement through it. The rest of Ocarina's dungeons don't require that kind of mental work. They're linear sequences of rooms with combat and puzzles. Aside from a tiny bit of the Forest Temple, navigation isn't a challenge, and puzzles are all self-contained within, at most, a few small rooms. I hesitate to even dignify some of these with the name puzzle. Shoot the eye in the wall, light the torches, play the Song of Time when you see the Song of Time logo, collect the silver rupees, use the item you recently got in the most obvious way. You've also got shitty block puzzles that take 2 seconds to solve but a minute to actually complete. I'm sure some of these trivial puzzles were challenging or novel when 3D gaming was new, but 3D gaming is not new and it's never going to be new again. Again, this video is concerning whether the game is good today, not how people perceived it at release. The last element of the dungeons, besides the puzzles, the combat, and the navigation, is bosses. They're sort of part combat and part puzzle, and in combining those two, the game does not get blood from stone. Many of them are simply a continuation of the dungeon formula where you apply the key item in an obvious way. Hit it with the hammer, throw a bomb at it, hit it with the hook shot, reflect it with the mirror shield. Energy tennis with Ganondorf is fun though, and him riding out of the painting on his horse is pretty spooky. I like it. Dungeons could have been a series of challenging puzzles that require you to get acquainted with a new item, culminating in a boss fight that requires mastery of your new tool. Unfortunately, except for the Water Temple, they are mindless, one-note affairs with puzzles and combat that feel like filler. Your time outside dungeons is spent on diversions like minigames and side quests, as well as solving riddles blocking your progress between dungeons. The side quest to get Epona is heartwarming, and I like riddles, but I wasn't exactly dying for a break from just mainlining the dungeons. I don't think they're demanding or stressful enough to need lighthearted diversions or breaks. Bombchu Alley Girl is cute though. So that's a quick rundown on why I think the gameplay of Ocarina of Time is at best functional. Now, I know what some of you may be thinking, I've heard it a lot. Cozy, everyone already knows that Ocarina has dull combat and puzzles that could only challenge a toddler. It's obvious that the gameplay is mindless mush, but Ocarina of Time isn't about the gameplay, it's about the soul. It's about exploring a magical world, a sense of adventure. It's about the innocence of childhood and the inevitability of time's withering march. It's tempting for me to dismiss these vague, feelsy notions, but I do have some responses to this sort of thing. My first question is, if the game isn't about combat, puzzles, and dungeons, then why was 90% of my time spent doing those things? When I was playing it, it sure seemed like that was what the game was about, because that's what I was doing the whole time. Second, if the game is about adventure or exploring the world, then it doesn't seem geared toward that. The world is small, there aren't many ways to interact with it that aren't combat or puzzles. You can't take photos, you can't have interesting conversations with NPCs. The most interesting areas of the game are all mandatory to visit. The game hardly had a feeling of adventure or exploration to me. When someone says they get a feeling from a game, that's not something I can disprove. I can state reasons why I didn't get that feeling, but beyond that, there's nothing definitive I can say. What I can say is that I think it's important to examine the reasons for your feelings. Many of these vague declarations are a result of not having replayed the game or thought about it enough. I too feel a sense of magic when I first play a great game like Dark Souls, or even watch a movie from a studio like Ghibli, but as you attentively replay a game or watch a movie, that indescribable magic impression tends to be replaced by an informed appreciation of the work. It's a less intense but more solid relationship to have with the work. If a feeling you have isn't durable enough to survive collision with the artwork itself, I don't think that's a valid point of praise. The feeling you get while playing a game can also be influenced by imported assumptions. If you hear that Ocarina is a magical journey, that it changed gaming, that it's the best game of all time, everything you do in the game will feel more significant. You're playing the meta-narrative surrounding the game more than you're playing the game itself at that point. Some people like to play like that. They'd rather take part in a long-running narrative surrounding a game, rather than gaining knowledge about the game itself. And if they're aware that's what they're doing, then I don't mind, it's a free country, but that type of play is not conducive to accurate games criticism. This video has been predicated on the idea that games should have deep gameplay and challenge. You may not believe all games need that. That's an argument for another video, but shouldn't the number one best game of all time have great gameplay? Could it really be correct to say that the best game ever has gameplay that works but isn't that hot? That just seems crazy to me. Can we at least agree that despite how great the presentation is, if a game has merely good gameplay, then it's no masterpiece? Ocarina of Time is a game of superficial charms. There's not much to chew on in the combat, puzzles, dungeons, overworld, or any single aspect of the game. It is hard to be truly bored when you're cycling through these activities while accompanied by the soundtrack, but it's also hard to be truly satisfied. Outside of the water temple, the game just does not ask anything of the player, so you won't get much in return. I got one playthrough of shallow amusement, and I won't be returning to it. Does Ocarina deserve to be shepherded through time as a fun game and an all-time classic, or is it a quaint museum piece that played its part in history and should now be read about instead of played? Aside from speedrunners, I can't say this game deserves to be played today. I respect its stature in history, but critical acclaim, perennial popularity, innovation, influence, these don't make a fun game. No matter how charming its frills are, the music, visuals, game feel, gameplay, variety, I don't think a game this shallow and piss easy is anywhere near the running for best game ever. Ocarina of Time is all hat and no cattle.